lasting impact. So the IMPM has been structured based on this presence of this premise. And so as the McGill, I should say EMBA and the McGill International Masters for Health Leadership, these were also inspired by this approach that leadership is management with lasting impact. And in this spirit, we launched this McGill Leadership Impact Series about a year and a half ago. It's a regular interactive webinar and focused on topics that we think would be interesting for management and leadership in order for all of us to have a lasting and positive influence in the world. So today, I'm very pleased to welcome a panel of accomplished individuals from diverse backgrounds and organizations to discuss the relevance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, in creating a competitive advantage for your organization. We'll also address some of the backlash against current DEI programs. Despite some of the proven benefits of DEI, some critics argue that these initiatives can be ineffective, tokenistic, or even discriminatory in themselves. So first, some introductions. Marcel La Liberté is Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at HEC Paris, Europe's leading business school. She has a doctorate in education, and her research focuses on student engagement, social justice, diversity, and inclusion. And some of her current work has been on how commitment to public service shapes university leadership response to national reforms, as well as increasing the visibility of women in aerospace as subject matter experts, and in the creation of AI. Seema Birney is a consultant and seasoned professional in areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion with over 20 years experience in the field. She was born and raised in Quebec with parents from Southeast Asia. And so Seema has always had a passion for diversity. In 2010, she founded Birney Consulting, a boutique firm offering services to organizations seeking to build a more inclusive workplace where everyone can belong. So thank you, Seema. Thank you, Marcel, for being here. Flavien Rode has focused his career on advancing LGBTQI plus rights globally, demonstrating his strategic leadership in spearheading multi-country and multicultural programs. He is the executive director of Positive Vibes Trust, which is a prominent African queer human rights organization. And Flavien's visionary guidance has expanded the organization's impact across Africa, Southwest and Northern Africa, Asia, and Central America over the past 9 years. Jaxa Gohil, who will be asking the questions today of the panel, has over 27 years of work experience in various areas and functions. Her last full-time role was heading HR for a technology company. She also worked for IKEA. She now works as a consultant in the areas of leadership development and diversity and inclusion. She believes HR is the custodian of the culture in an organization and plays a key role in the success of an organization. Jaxa is also a proud graduate of the International Masters Program for Managers, and so is Flavien. So we have two IMPM grads with us today. So thank you all four of you for joining. Jaxa will begin today's webinar by asking the rest of the panel some questions, which we hope will ignite some thought and perhaps some debate on the importance of DEI in creating a competitive advantage. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be shared with today's attendees and with those who cannot make it to today's webinar. If you prefer not to be seen, please feel free to turn off your video. Please do keep yourself on mute for the duration of the webinar. We will begin with Jaxa asking the panelists some questions, and then for the last 20 minutes or so, we'll open the webinar to questions from all of you. At that time, I ask that you raise your hand icon, at which point I can unmute you and let you ask the question. You're also welcome to put questions or comments in the chat throughout the panel discussion, and I'll try and make sure your question or comment is addressed by the panel. I apologize in advance if I don't get to everyone's question or comment. So welcome panelists. I will pass it over to Jaxa.
Okay, so thank you, Ron, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I'm going to start with this very simple question for our panel, okay? So Marcel, Flavian, and Seema, the first question for you guys is, what is DEI? What does diversity mean? What does equity mean? And what does inclusion mean? So first, I'm just going to ask all of you to give your perspective on that, and then we'll take it forward from there. So if I can start with Seema.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Welcome, everybody. DEI. So diversity for me means really everything that makes us who we are. And it goes beyond what we hear in the media just about sexual orientation or gender or race, ethnicity. It's everything, age, it's what department you work in. Are you unionized, not unionized? Really all those sort of different elements of our identity and sort of the intersection of all that. And equity is really about ensuring that regardless of what identity you have and the different identities you bring, do you have the same opportunities? Is there equitable opportunities and equal access to different opportunities? And last but not least, probably the most important is inclusion, because we put a lot of emphasis on diversity and representation, but you can have diversity and not get the benefits out of it. And what I mean is you could have women around the table in different backgrounds, but if those people don't have a voice that's listened to, then you don't have inclusion. And inclusion is really that piece in the culture that makes it that if you have diversity, everyone's voice is heard and everyone's opinion counts and you can really contribute. So they really go hand in hand. And so that's why you kind of need all of those elements, in my opinion, to get some of the benefits that we'll be talking about.
Thank you, Seema. Flavian, can I ask you to go? DEI.
Sure. Good afternoon from Cape Town, everyone. I suppose Seema did a really good job of talking about DEI and what that means. Maybe I'll take a little step back and perhaps answer or reflect a little bit on why I think DEI is important from my perspective. I think it remains one of the very important ways or strategies within which we can challenge structural determinants of othering or structural determinants of what pushes those who are different to live in the fringes of society or to exist as somewhat second-class citizens. And it is fundamentally, I think, an approach to tackle a society that is fundamentally patriarchal. And I think so the world of work is fundamentally patriarchal. It was really set up for men to thrive. And I think that system is undergoing some sort of fracture, still figuring out what it means to meaningfully include women, I think. And now there's additional pressure on that system, and it's struggling to cope because now you're bringing this idea of sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression into that system that also now would like to be seen and heard. And I think DEI is a way in which that system has an opportunity or can find a way or operationalize a method to respond to what that inclusion or that transformation looks like. And I think it is a difficult process. I think it's a process that causes a lot of people fear and anxiety. And I think it actually it's a strategy that is implemented that requires some fundamental and significant shifts for us to be able to meaningfully speak to what that means. I just saw a camera pop up of one of my very good friends being shaken a bit. So yeah, that's sort of from my perspective why I think it's important and that the world of work provides a significant avenue to tackle that structural determinant of othering and difference. Thanks.
Thank you, Flavian. So Marcel, last but not least, but if you can first DEI, and then I'm going to ask you to continue as well with the next question. But if you can first just talk about a little bit about DEI, your perspective.
Thank you, and good afternoon from Paris, France. So this is lovely to have sort of this international panel and to be with you all today. DEI as a question always politely drives me a little. I find that it's very much part of the definitions that I like to work with organizations. If I sort of repackage that in a sense, is often when people ask me what I define DEI, I can give academic speak on what they mean, but I think it's important to define those terms within your own organizations or contexts. And then it speaks more volumes. It's not a copy paste situation. It really is, how do you adapt and understand it to your context? Diversity, in Europe, what I share with students is we try to look at we know that through neurosciences, we create categories above 150 relationships. We can manage up to 150 people in our lives in terms of contacts. And above that number, we can have LinkedIn with thousands of people and our social media and our large networks of professional people. But through neurosciences, we can only manage 150 close relationships. And so we naturally create categories, hence the diversity side of things. On the equity, and Flavian brought it up, and I think that's brilliant too, is this notion of resources. How do we share those resources? Who gets the resources, to Seema's point? And on the inclusion is, yes, are you heard? Who is represented? Who's being heard? Do you feel that you can be heard? And can you express yourselves? You know, again, on the neuroscience side of things, we know that people make on average between 30 and 35,000 decisions a day. Now, someone who's faced with challenges, be it socioeconomic background, ethnicity, faces different challenges to get going in the morning, for example. And when they show up to work, they're already probably a little bit more tired than the average person that doesn't have the same kind of barriers. And so that inclusion matters because that person's social battery is already a bit more used than somebody else's. And if we want to make sure that that voice is heard, then we need to know to check in on our, you know, all the different members of our community. And so that's the academic speak, but at the end of the day, I would throw it back to organizations like it's for you to define.
So that actually takes me to the next question. It's for you as well, Marcel. Okay, so in terms of implementing D&I strategy in an organization and how it manifests itself, can you give us some examples of something that's worked well and maybe something that didn't work well and it actually surprised you as well? But how have you gone about implementing or helping organizations implement a successful D&I strategy?
So I often, when I share with students and different organizations that I work, I use a framework to sort of help navigate strategies within organizations. And the strategy is built around 3 points. One is know the individuals. So as much as I'm, and I say a 50-year-old Canadian white woman, all those good things, those are the identities that I project out, but I also have the identities within the value systems that I've chosen to, you know, accept, the ones that I project out, the ones that are internalized that my parents gave me or my community gave me. That already need to know who those individuals are that I'm going to be interacting with at a strategic point within the organization. Then I need to understand what's going on in terms of group dynamics. What is the culture of the organization? And we'll come back to that, I'm pretty sure, in a couple conversations, but are we in a collaborative organization? Are we in a competitive organization? Is it creative? Like these different dimensions that can exist in organizations in terms of defining their culture, and how do those group dynamics play out in a sense? Again, with those neurosciences, we know when I talk about the 150, the prime number is usually around 4 or 5. 4 or 5 is like sort of the key number in terms of group dynamics, to be able to exchange ideas, to talk it out. When we add numbers, it starts getting a little messy. And we've all noticed it. If you're sitting at a big table for a big dinner with like 10, 12 people, you'll naturally speak with about 4 people around you. That's as much as you'll handle in those types of settings. Those apply in organizations too. And last but not least, I often wonder what's going on in terms of context. So if I'm in France or if I'm in Germany, England, wherever, I wonder what's going on in terms of society. What are the social tensions that I may be observing? So in France, there was a lot about the Yellow Vest movement or the riots that we had recently last summer. And we'll talk about legal frameworks too. What legislation, what changes have been applied? And those 3 dimensions in terms of strategy is how I will assess where to address change. And address change with those 3 dimensions in mind. If I fail in one of those 3 dimensions, or I don't address it during the project, then it will not work. It'll work for maybe 6 months at tops, and then we'll just go back to our old habits. Because at the end of the day, what we're dealing with is change management 101. Now, examples of organizations that may not have done so well, it's coming back to those 3 dimensions. If one of them's not being addressed, that's where failure occurs, in my humble opinion. But I know Seema has probably got tons of experience on this and may add some elements, or Flavian in the sort of the ONG space too. I think it's 2 spaces that are so important to hear from.
Yeah, I think Marcel, when you were first talking in breaking down the three elements, it really, the first step is really the data, the information you need. And it's interesting because you went into it right away, and some of the organizations I work with don't think about that. And they might consult me and say, okay, we really need to bring our DEI strategy. What do you know? And the first question is, well, what information do you have? And sometimes they have nothing. You know, in Canada, we do a lot more demographic surveys, and in North America, I know that there are a lot more. We had talked about it once about the privacy legislation in some places that you can't ask questions. In North America, you can, it can be voluntary. And I'd say the companies that are a little bit more advanced on the DEI spectrum can, you know, really ask questions about sexual orientation and different, if they have the right culture. But I have organizations that I work with where they have no data and they're not comfortable to get the data. And so then it becomes very tricky, because what issues are you dealing with? What problems are you trying to solve? And many times the leaders will say, well, I don't think we have any issues really, because nothing has come to light. You know, it can, most of the time that's a red flag to say there's probably a lot of issues, but you haven't gone and done it. So I think the most important thing to start with is to get information, and I love it along those three different lines, to start with data. And usually where things do fail, in my experience, is when we start, you know, sometimes I'm brought in and it's already too late. You know, they've already started implementing strategies, but they've never actually kind of done the homework before. So it really, really is important to take the time to get the proper data and understand where the issues are. And it doesn't always have to be done with surveys, you know, focus groups, just finding out, you know, different things. But a lot of organizations are a little bit scared, I think, to even dig, because they're scared of what they're going to find. And, you know, but that means that their strategy is not coming from a place of wanting to really transform. And as you said, Marcel, very eloquently, it's change management, which is huge, right? It's really big to be, you know, DEI is part of that, of changing the culture. And so I think it starts with really great data. But I'll let my colleague Flavien add to that if you have anything to add. Flavien, no.
No, and I think what Simo is sharing in terms of data, if I may, it's important also across the world. We know that data regulation is not the same. Europe has quite strict laws. France, for example, will not allow us to look in terms of ethnic or cultural backgrounds as a point. So it changes how you approach your situation. That's why I said that societal legal framework matters. It's not impossible, because you can ask on the flip side, how do you perceive yourself? Within organizations, you can say, do you perceive that you're from a minority group? Do you perceive that your organization, and that it allows you already, like Seema pointed out, to be able to start sort of, okay, where are my pain points and what am I not understanding or hearing from my community?
I think sometimes as an organizational perspective, sometimes we have we have data and we're sitting on it and we don't even know. I know one of the reports that we had a team member report, and when we got the survey results back, it said 2% of the population had said that they belong to the LGBT community, but we were doing nothing for them. And I'm like, so what are we going to do with this? So have you had any, when you're working with organizations, if you can give an example of what kind of data are you like sparks your interest, I would say?
Usually when I meet with organizations and they're not too clear on the data, like Simo was sharing, the first point of areas that I point to are like, all right, how are your recruitment strategies working out for you? And how long are you holding on to certain populations? For example, Gen Z, what's going on in that? And usually there's like, oh yeah, we've gotten a huge turnover rate, or yeah, there seems to be a disconnect. And that opens up a whole conversation. And to realize that we do have a lot of data, that, like you were saying, that we sit on a lot of data, but we just don't really understand what it means to us, because we don't usually put it all together in one spot and go, right, there's this picture that's appearing, and we're starting to see something emerge. But usually those are the two first ones. The recruitment and retention are, most organizations know where they stand on those 2 points.
Even just
so if I can ask one further question to data related to recruitment, actually, when a company has say a gender policy to say 50-50 as an example, are you a fan of it or not a fan of it? What do you guys say? But some people say then that becomes a quota and you're not being fair to X community, etc., etc. What's your take on that?
That's a loaded question. I think I like having objectives because I think if you don't move towards an objective, but there's a big difference in Canada, US, there's a big difference. So we've always had objectives, and the US, from my understanding, has had a lot more on quotas. And the quota thing has created, and we'll talk about some of the backlash, but that has been creation of some of the backlash. Because let's just say I go into an organization and I say, okay, we saw this after the murder of George Floyd, for example. Okay, you know what? 1/3 of our hires are going to be, people of color or Black, but they have no culture to support that. They never thought of recruitment strategies. They don't have that pool of candidates, yet they now have a commitment to fill a certain number of people, and then they do it, and that doesn't work, right? Because now that's tokenism that sends the wrong message. And even if you do have the right people, they might be perceived as not the right people, right? Because you don't have a culture that supports it. So I'm a little bit weary, but I do think you need to have some objectives, because we know that when you have objectives, things move. There's too many organizations that don't set objectives. So I think they have to be, in my opinion, objectives, but there has to be some flexibility, and you can't go from 0 to 50 in one day. I think you have to really map it out and then build the strategies that support it. That's the way I see it.
Okay,
Yeah.
so Seema, actually the next question was for you anyway. So competitive advantage. DEI, do you see it as a competitive advantage, or do you think it's a myth? And once again, can you give some examples of how you have been able to implement it with organizations that you work with?
Yeah, so definitely, I think there's so much research on the different aspects of diversity, equity, inclusion that lead to benefits. I know McKinsey comes out with their studies every year, and BCG. So there's many different studies, but one I wanted to highlight that I think is sort of a no-brainer for all of us, and it doesn't really need data to support it. It's your personal experience, is when you work in an organization where you feel that you count, that you can speak up, that you feel included, normally you feel more productive, you're more engaged. There was actually one study that I always like to highlight when I'm doing training for senior leaders. It's about their level of commitment and what that does to employees. So BCG did a study in 2022 where they looked at 21 different countries, thousands of employees, and they measured the level of the perception employees had of the leadership team's commitment to DEI. And when that commitment level was seen as very high, 84% of employees felt valued and respected. When it was seen as low, it was only 44%, and very low commitment was only 14% of employees feeling valued and respected. And what's interesting, two things. Number one, this is employees' perception of senior leaders. So sometimes senior leaders, executives think they're doing the right things, but if the employees don't perceive it that way, they won't get those benefits. And the second thing is, this is all employees. So we tend to think that DEI strategies are only for underrepresented groups. It's for all groups. It's for everyone. So if it's done properly, you're going to see those benefits. And of course, employees who feel valued and respected are going to then, will have lower turnover, better engagement, more productivity. So a lot of those benefits that come from just the employee engagement aspect. And then, of course, there's innovation. So we talk a lot about diversity as driving innovation, creativity. And, in terms of organizations, there's a lot out there. One that I think that's done a really great job is the pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly. They've been famous for sort of their innovative collaboration, open innovation, actually. So 20 years ago, they started a platform called Innocentive, and it was based on the fact that there was much more likelihood of solving an issue if you didn't have expertise in that area. So they were having issues apparently solving a toxicology problem. They couldn't figure it out. Somebody said, hey, why don't we crowdsource this? And originally the leadership said, no, we have all the experts here. How could someone else help us with this? And, finally they did so, and the issue was solved very quickly. And so what we saw was having people that have a completely diverse perspective, who've never seen that problem before, are coming from a different field of expertise, bring fresh eyes to that and that creativity. And that's really, I think, where the benefits of diversity and inclusion come in, is having different perspectives. And that's the part where on a day-to-day basis, we don't think about, like, how often do we llisten to the youngest person in the room who just came in out of university? We often tend to minimize that voice. Oh, you don't know anything. You haven't been here long enough. Or how often do, I used to work in HR, but, when I invite somebody from the IT department to one of my meetings to help with something, I'm probably going to assume that they don't have the expertise, but maybe they can. So that's where I think that there's a lot of benefits on diversity, as far as the innovation is coming from these different perspectives.
Okay. All right. Flavian.
I don't know what happened. I
Okay.
didn't get dropped.
All right, not sure what happened with it because you're
I
doing
think
something.
we just lost him for a second. I think he'll be back in a minute.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to, Marcel, I'm going to come back to you. But in terms of, you mentioned earlier when we were talking different culture in terms of different cultures. If you can share a little bit about that when it comes to competitive advantage, how have you seen different cultures embracing different areas of DEI, etc.? I think if you can talk a little bit about that and give some examples. And Flavian is back now.
Flavian is back, exactly.
Okay,
I get lost. 2 seconds.
Flavian. Okay, so let me go to Flavian then and say anyway.
Yeah.
Sorry, Marcel, I'll come back to you. All right, but
Don't worry
Flavian, what
about it.
advice would you give to somebody when it comes to DEI and implementing the strategies? And if you can talk a little bit about cultural nuances as well, please, that would be good. And specific examples. Thank you. We can't hear you.
You're muted.
Sorry, folks, and please excuse me, I'm on my phone because South Africa has got a thing called load shedding. So the power just went and it was unscheduled. So I'm in a bit of a situation, but hopefully you can hear me. I think it's important to think about where we start. The best way, I think, to get going is that the intent behind diversity, equity, and inclusion is co-owned, and that folks can see the benefit for this in that. And I think one of the ways to get there, which was mentioned by Seema, is this idea of setting objectives. What does that diversity profile potentially look like where you work? And how do you see the benefit for yourself where you have experienced areas of marginalization and are potentially mattering within that? And therefore to start from an approach that is fundamentally person-centered, I think is critical. And to invest in processes where folks have enough time to unpack their own values, the extent to which those values are influencing attitudes and how those attitudes are manifesting in behaviors around spaces where we are having to come into contact with things that are different to us. And I think the answer lies in us having the opportunity to speak about our own experiences of exclusion, of marginalization, and in that way identifying spaces where we can recognize how others may have experienced that same thing, where they have been marginalized, and the significant shift that happens when from marginalization we go to mattering. Another element to consider is that it's important to make space where that dialogue can take place for you to ask challenging questions around the theme of those things that you do not understand. I know often sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, people wanting to be seen as their whole selves, being referred to with pronouns that they feel are representative of them and give them dignity, is often an area of contention. Talking about gender neutral bathrooms, and I think instead of just forcing those kinds of changes on individuals and organizations, in my experience, creating space for people to ask the difficult questions, and over time being able to move from a place of not understanding to understanding, and then challenging their own values and attitudes, and how some of them might be harmful to people who are different to me. We have had a lot of success when we work just in shifting social norms within communities. That's often where the silver bullet is like for us in terms of trying to make some of these changes. Yeah.
Jax, I think you're muted.
Great. Thanks. Thank you, Seema. Thank you, Flavian. So now a question for all of you. So when it comes to D&I, we touched a little bit about this, but is it really namesake? Is it something that is just a tick box or a check mark? And why are we having more and more, people questioning whether it's successful, it's impactful? What's your perspective on that? What needs to be done differently? How can some of these strategies be implemented more effectively in a better way? And if I can start with Seema first, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to hear my colleagues' perspectives on this, because I know in North America, especially my neighbors in the South, DEI is evil right now. It's really, really, getting a lot of backlash. Just yesterday, I had read that, a company like Unilever, who I used to highlight as one of the leaders in DEI because they were doing a lot of great work in their area, are now pulling back on some of the initiatives because of that backlash. So I think whenever the pendulum swings one way, it often does kind of come back to the middle. And I know that, again, here, after the murder of George Floyd, a lot of companies really jumped on the DEI bandwagon, some for the right reasons. I think it was a wake-up call for a lot of people who hadn't recognized, sort of race inequity, et cetera, that there is an issue and there's a problem. And companies who thought they got it right didn't. And so for the first time, a lot of leadership teams were looking at this differently, and some in the right way and taking time to come up with robust strategies. A lot of organizations, however, were very reactive, and it becomes more of this what we call performative, and whether it was well-intentioned or not, coming up with strategies that are trying to fix something that has been systematically wrong for decades and decades. And in that organization, if you haven't worked on your DEI strategy, you've never considered this, you can't go from A to Z in one day or even 2 years. But it's a long-term, as Bobby is saying, it's a long-term thing, and you have to go sort of piece by piece. So I think there was a lot of action taken and not the right actions. And now we're seeing sort of the repercussions of that because it wasn't effective. And, then we start to hear about things like, well, it's reverse discrimination and all these different, and all the objectives that they set were unrealistic and discriminatory. So I think that backlash, I understand where it's coming from. But it's still curious to me because when we look at why we believe in diversity, we were just talking about this, just simple things as employees feeling welcome and included, it seems like a no-brainer. And it's almost funny because this has now become the scapegoat for some organizations to say, no, we're just cutting all DEI. It's all not helping. And I don't think that's the reality. I think some of the strategies have been ineffective, but I think we can all see from the different research and studies and even our own personal experiences of feeling included why it's important to continue doing that work. But there is definitely a reason where that backlash is coming from.
So do you think it's a bit, I'm just curious from all three of you actually, when it comes to the backlash, is it because of where society is? Is it because of the leadership? Is it because budgets? I don't know. Like, do you see any kind of patterns that come through there, why this backlash happens?
Yeah, I'd probably like to respond. I think we have to consider that within the last 3 to 5 years, the global north particularly, based on the shifts within global politics, has become a lot more conservative. And I don't think that necessarily there is an upsurge of more conservative views which are influencing the changes within industry and potentially the restricted views on DEI. I think they've always been there. But I do think that there is accountability that needs to be taken by global leaders, and they're very dismissive and very patriarchal and very narrow-minded narratives. And you know who some of those folks might be that I'm speaking about, have given a lot of have given a lot of thoughts that have always been under the surface a lot, and a lot of folks within these systems a lot more confidence to be way more restrictive around some of the more dismissive thoughts around this idea and the narrative of inclusion. So I do think that the shift is very influenced by, if you look at parliaments across the Netherlands, Sweden, recently within the US, and likely maybe again, a lot more conservative leadership and narratives are prevailing within the world of not only politics and also how that influences the sector I work in within development and therefore industry. So a lot of the genesis for this, I think, sits within prevailing narrative of way more conservative opinions that are okay to share now. It is okay to be sharing such significant hate speech and dissent. It is accepted in the world. And I think it probably reminds us that a lot of those areas of exclusion has gone unaddressed in the past. And it's manifesting itself within our world of work, I think. So I think maybe that's one of my initial responses to your question, Jaxa.
Thank you. Marcel, you were shaking your head, so what would you like to add?
I think this conversation is so important, and it's the same with, when I have students or workshops that I do with organizations, I always start off with, we're going to be uncomfortable. And I think we've forgotten how to navigate uncomfortable conversations. And I say this, I'm beet red, you can't tell by the camera. I never love public speaking, but if I don't step out of my comfort zone to try to share or and call myself out, like with students, I'm like, good news guys, I'm human. I make mistakes. I make them every day. And we all traverse these different, these different roles that we play. Either we see something that we don't like, either we offend, and either we are just a bystander observing. But we will navigate those three dimensions regularly. So there's not like the perfection on one side and the stark evil on the other side. It's really a notion of fear and trying to embrace complicated conversations. And I embrace the fact when students speak up about exactly the question that you asked at the beginning, Jaxa, around, male dominance, or is it just checking the box in a sense around diversity? I feel like I'm a diversity hire. The fact that students can ask that question, I'm like, yes, let's ask that question and let's peel it back, try to understand what's going on. And I think this is what we're losing a lot of, is understanding what's going on. When I look at the US and the DEI backlash, there's been some great pieces to try to explain who's behind that backlash. Actually, it's not that many people when you look at it. When you take it through and you look at those email exchanges, there was a huge investigative report that came out, I think in January, and you're like, right. But we don't allow ourselves to sort of critically think or critically assess, because we just listen to that fear. And it's safe, there's safety in fear. It doesn't make it that this is an easy place to be. Like I said, beat red, I'm still very red. And I know I'm going to make mistakes, but if I don't dare ask the question, how the heck are we going to start sort of peeling it back and understanding what's going on? And by extension, some of the points that we raised in terms of quotas and objectives, I'm a firm believer in it has to be part of a program. The academic in me is speaking again, but what are we trying to achieve when we put in quotas? Is it part of, these multi-levers that we have at work around our individuals, our groups, our society? It's not just a one of, it's bringing these different environments together to be able to address what we want to address.
Dex, I think we have time for one more question, and then maybe we'll open it up to questions from the audience.
Okay, so a very interesting question for all of you, and maybe this is a bit of a test, but when it comes to the buzzword ESG and SDGs, who wants to first tell us what they mean and what is the difference?
This is where I defer to all of you.
I could try and tackle it. I think the easiest way for me to understand it, look, I think diversity, equity, and inclusion speak across a number of SDGs, at least 7, whether it be education, whether it be well-being, whether it be access. And I think what DEI does is it allows us, or it helps us figure out a way to address how we move incrementally towards achieving some of the SDGs. It is the simplest way that I typically understand it. And so DEI provides us with the operational strategy within the various ways that we work and within the areas where we have control to be able to tackle moving towards achieving sustainable development goals, which is what it stands for, whether it be around well-being, whether it be around education, whether it be around poverty alleviation, whether it be around access, whether it be to health, safety, civic engagement, etc.
Yeah, to add to what Flavian was saying, in one side we've got the SDGs in terms of goals, so sustainable development goals. On the CSR side of things, it's our responsibility. If we wanted to go further, we also have sort of the governance side of things around ERGs, because there's the ERGs, the employee resource groups, but there's also the environment, the other side of things. But it's part again of a program in a sense. We have goals, we have governance, we have reporting, and ways of action plans of how do we get to those goals. And it's a movement towards sort of having a coherent plan to be able to address change.
Okay, so something in terms of reporting, you mentioned reporting. How good is reporting today from organizations, from countries, to make sure that we're getting towards these goals that we have as a planet?
I think countries report on SDGs. I think there's no real political will or pressure to report in ways. I think there is. I think as much as the SDGs intents and has a solid and a positive intent, I think there's very little pressure the United Nations can put on governments really to report. Reporting is often last minute. If I just speak about the countries that I'm aware of, and I'm talking about 6 where I'm quite involved, in Africa at least, it's often last minute from government. It's often scrambling a little bit to hear from civil society and others what what may have been done. So I think, again, the political will and commitment after we've signed a document often is lacking in terms of moving towards SDGs. And I do think industry and the world of work provide a significant area where we can take some strides towards how we are addressing the SDGs. But I do think that the system for reporting nationally is actually rather poor.
So in an organization, what can an organization do to report things in a better way? How can they keep themselves accountable better? What can leaders over here do?
I think one of the issues when it's reporting, and I'll just talk about in Canada, we have employment equity reporting and some of those things, is that they're not always congruent. Like it takes a long time for those reports to be, for example, using the right language, or like, they don't move with the times. Like at least in employment equity reporting, the types of data that's reported hasn't changed in 20 years, and more than 20 years, actually. It's been like even more than that. And so what happens is a lot of that reporting becomes a bureaucratic process where it does become last minute because it's hard to fit it in, so sort of we kind of get that out of the way, and then we work on our DEI strategy, which is more advanced and more robust. And I think if the United Nations and other government agencies want better reporting, they have to be more agile and quick to make sure that it matches what's happening, because especially when we're talking about diversity, it's changing all the time. When I started in this work 20 years ago, we would talk about homosexuality, that was we were discussing that. Today, it's much more about, gender fluidity, and there's new issues, but they haven't even gotten sexual orientation into the employment equity reporting yet. So they're way, way behind. So I think if we want better reporting, we really have to make sure that these systems and these governance, can also be more agile and flexible. But I think that's a huge ask, and I don't see that happening personally anytime soon.
Okay. Marcel, anything you would like to add, or then I'm going to pass it over to Ron for the Q&A, actually.
I think, the time for the Q&A would be wonderful to hear people's thoughts or reactions.
Okay, so
Great.
open to everybody, and over to you, Ron. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we open up the questions to the audience. Just raise your hand if you want to ask a question and we'll unmute you. Please feel free if you have a comment or a question for the panelists. Now's your chance. I have, just to start us off, I have one question. I was intrigued by this conversation about the context that Marcel was referring to, the context of your organization, and what does diversity, equity, and inclusion mean for your organization. And often I think, and that's one of the reasons I think there's a lot of backlash, is because the narrative right now in the news and everything is diversity, equity, inclusion is about gender and sexuality, and we lose sight of all the other diverse elements that can be part of a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. And so I think organizations don't always have to feel daunted by the task of tackling those two issues, which are very, very important. But if I speak about, for instance, this IMPM program that we have, one of the things that we are, passionate and proud about is having people from different sectors and different countries and different value systems in the program, but also different socioeconomic backgrounds. So when you have, let's say, an executive MBA that costs $200,000 a year, you may have 50% women and 25% Black people and a diverse cohort, but essentially they're all rich people. So even in the context of education, sometimes I think we lose sight of what diversity can mean, and that it can be much broader than what's been portrayed lately. And I think that's where some of the backlash may be coming from, is that this focus on those two dimensions, which is gender and sexuality, when it's really much, much more than that. So anyways, that was more of a comment than a question, but if you guys have something to add to that, feel free.
I was just gonna say, Ron, that one of the important things when we're talking about diversity is that everyone feels included. And so, of course, when I'm doing leadership training, there's a high predominance of white men in the group. But again, as you said, there's other dimensions, and it's not that, gender and race ethnicity are not important dimensions, because they're huge ones, but there are others, and everyone has to feel included. And it also, we talk about allyship and how, we're not going to move the needle unless we have the inclusion of everybody. And so sometimes those who are in the majority group often feel like diversity is about the others, like it's us versus them, and it's really about everybody, and finding those different ways to include everyone. And by mentioning other areas like, socioeconomic, I think the different sectors we work in is a really good one, because we don't realize, for example, when we're hiring, oh, well, we always have to hire people from like industry experience. And I'm like, okay, but why? You already have people with experience. What about something different, right? And so I think that's one of the ways to make sure that that's addressed as well.
And I know we have a question from Danielle, but I would just add, one of the elements when I talk about context too is we tend to say, oh, well, that company's doing that, so we should do the same. That institutional isomorphism that occurs, we copy and paste, but it doesn't work because it's copy and paste. That's why that context and understanding who you are as an organization matters so much.
Thank you. Daniel, go ahead.
Hello. Yeah, I'm teaching undergrads in Japan, and I have to teach Introduction to Business. And so in one of the weeks, we just do DEI, right? So we look at diversity. And yeah, I think what Marcel, you were saying, how people feel uncomfortable. Like some of the questions we ask and some of the answers people give make us feel uncomfortable. And then like this past year, one of the students was saying, why do we have to feel uncomfortable? I mean, I don't feel uncomfortable until this class. So why do we have to do a class where, I was like, well, other people are feeling uncomfortable, right? And maybe now you're feeling uncomfortable, but they were feeling it, and maybe they're less uncomfortable now and you're more, but so we're now we're all feeling uncomfortable. And they're like, well, what's good about that? Yeah. That sounds worse than a few people feeling uncomfortable, but we're kind of sharing the uncomfortable, then maybe overall it's going down. I don't know. So I was just wondering how, Marcel, when people like give an answer like that, if you've had that experience, how you react to that.
So I always work the class that I do empathy maps. And through the empathy maps, I put them in the persona. I usually try to do a context within the university because it's something that they're very familiar with. And we all have had criticisms towards our faculty or towards staff or towards our students. So it's an easy case study in a sense. And then I'm like, all right, you're the dean of the school and you have to solve for gender equality, for example. Or you've had issues with, you've had some tensions with what's going on in the Middle East. Put yourself in that person's shoes and let's do an empathy map. What's he saying or she saying? What are they doing? What are they thinking? And what may they be feeling? And having them focus on another person, then they're like, huh, right, I get why there's some uncomfortable, and now I can appreciate it more. And I found it to be a very revealing exercise in terms of engaging with students, because it takes the onus away from them, like why is
right.
And it focuses, all right, like, and of course, tomorrow, if you're going to be in managers, because you teach business classes, right? So you're going to manage teams. This will help you tremendously with your teams and with your hierarchy.
And another one, if I can jump, example that I've used in an exercise is to do an exercise where you ask people to explore a time in their life where they have felt marginalized. It may be because I was the young child. It may be because I joined the school and I couldn't speak the language. It may be because I got the lowest marks. It may be for a number of reasons. In my family, I don't have much to, I can't say very much because I'm one of the younger cousins. And to explore that experience, and then to explore the experience of now reflect on a time where you really mattered, where your voice really mattered, and what that feels like. And it's difficult to explain why, but people's personal experiences of being marginalized very quickly helps them access that part of their brain where they realize what it must be like for somebody else where they continuously feel marginalized. And it's easy to follow up with the example. It's a very simple exercise I've done quite, and then how that engages in a discussion, and it really builds a lot of empathy within a group discussion, if it's helpful.
Super. Yeah, thank you both very much.
Thank you. We have a question from Eula in the chat. Eula asks, one of the challenges I see is senior executives not noticing inequitable practices in their organizations. How do you get leaders on board who don't even recognize that there's whether it's an issue or an opportunity, however you want to look at it? How do you get leaders engaged in this process and convinced that it's important to implement a DEI strategy. Anyone from the panel?
I could start, and then of course I'll let my colleagues add. That happens a lot where, for example, I do training sometimes with leadership teams, and then after I train the managers in different levels where the leaders aren't there. And sometimes some of those topics to come up, and you know, the employees say, well, like they don't get it, they don't realize. And so I find that's often lack of data, for example. So you even doing things like focus groups, sometimes these leadership teams are well-intentioned, but they don't see what they don't see, right? They're sort of in their bubble, they haven't paid attention, they might be having different obstacles and or, you know, be in a position of privilege. So even just focus groups and having data to show and say, this is what people are feeling can sometimes at least open up so their minds to that, because if you don't have those key examples, then they tend to think because nobody's raising the hand and pointing things out that everything's fine, or you know, they're going about their day-to-day, they're not confronted with it all the time. And so there were a few cases again in the last few years where, you know, there were focus groups done and there was a lot more research done, and the leadership teams were humbled and shocked, even sometimes say, wow, we had no idea that this is how this group of people felt. And again, you know, I mentioned George Floyd before because it was really a big catalyst for a lot of the work done in Canada and US, but that was an eye-opener. I worked with a few organizations that said, we thought we were doing it right, and we didn't realize this is how our Black employees are feeling, for example. And so I think it's important to get that data first, because leaders, you know, they need data, right? They want to, that's often something that speaks to leadership teams is, you know, what's the data, what are people feeling? And I think that's one of the ways that you can get that information.
Anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, maybe I can just share an example of it was quite shocking to me. So the organization I work in, I'm executive director of a global nonprofit, and we are fundamentally a human rights organization. So this idea of everybody sharing and everybody being open and everybody being listened to is a significant part of how we function in our culture. But because we work fundamentally in LGBT and women's rights, and that we're very rights forward, through one of our focus group discussions, figuring out some of the nuances and areas within our own culture where we need to grow, it was shocking to us as a senior team where we found out that a lot of our Christian colleagues feel like their Christian views in such a progressive organization are very unpopular. People don't want to play their gospel music. And it was a huge eye-opener for us that even if you are super rights forward, to remain open to the fact that often people will be marginalized depending on the prevailing culture, even if it is perceived to be a positive one. As well as our Islamic colleagues, they had a similar reflection that we feel that as much as I'm a huge supporter of Islam, I have to, or you know, I'm a Muslim, I have to leave that identity behind if I come into the workspace, because it's all about queer rights and equality and constantly speaking truth to power and constantly being abrasive around things that don't feel inclusive. And it was a huge shock for me as a leader, thinking that I'm super open, but my own attitude and my own brash way in which I march and litigate in court around human rights also created a culture where colleagues were, and I think, did not feel like they could be open. If it were not for us running focus groups across a number of areas within our organization, and not just sort of the typical ones, because a lot of this came from finance and admin, it was a really interesting reflection, and maybe I thought I'd share that example. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think if there's anyone that has one last question, we have another minute. If anyone wants to ask another question,
I think
otherwise
Martin has his hand raised.
Yes, sir, Professor.
Hi everyone. Yeah, thanks very much for this. I'm just interested to ask for some reflections on the challenging and perhaps exhausting and emotionally charged nature of this work, and how individuals involved in this can support each other in it, because I think it kind of rubs up against all sorts of things, yes? So it is exhausting work, it's ongoing work, so I'm interested to just hear your reflections on that, really.
Who'd like to go first?
I have to say humbly, the network, you know, we get to meet some amazing, again, today I've met new people. And I think this is what sort of bolsters me or gives me a lot of energy is these spaces where I get to meet colleagues that are working in the space and how we handle these different situations. It's one of the rare spaces where I actually don't feel like I'm in competition against somebody else. It's like, oh, Seema, what are you doing? Okay, you got that. Cool. This is what I've got going on here. Oh, it's just such a great knowledge sharing sort of space. And I have not met in all the interactions that I've had. I've been in this role now for 3 years. And that I think gives me just enough boost to go forward. And it's both in academia, but also with companies, you know, that I've worked with all across the world. We always come back to the, you know, we see the positive, we see the change. We've painted a lot of, you know, negative things right now, obviously, and the challenges that are in the space, but we do see change. We see change in the positive side of things too. The numbers go up and down, but they're trending overall upwards. We're not where we were 50 years ago, and I can only hope of where we're going to be in the next 50 years. And AI is very scary things on some fronts, but it's an interesting boost to be able to address what's going on or to think outside the box and address it. So it's just really that power of network. Long answer, short spiel, but that's what kind of gives me strength in a sense to do what we do.
Yeah, I've got a short input. Hi, Martin. Nice to see you. Thanks for the question. We work in social norms work fundamentally. That's what we do, right? And I think DEI, a lot of it is very much challenging the idea of social norms. And I think one of the things that motivates us is we celebrate even the smallest ones. We take time to look at it and go, you know what? Let's reflect on our story. Let's take time and reflect on what happened. Let's chat about and take stock of what was tough. And then let's celebrate even the small one, because we recognize that we're working in a space where we're trying to change things that are almost invisible. So for us, it's about celebrating even the small ones and the small advances, and to not take them lightly and to not just go, oh, well. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I would just add with Marcel, like definitely having a network. And I totally agree. I work with a lot of people who could be considered competitors, but they're not, because there's so much work to do. I think the more people we have doing it, you know, we're all sort of valued. I think we do this work because we believe in it. But you're right, it's not easy. And I'll be completely honest that there are days where I have a client that's so behind and I'm like, oh my God, I feel like I'm back in 2000. And then I have another client that, you know, sort of is really advanced and it encourages me. But I've also started to become choosy. I refuse to work with certain types of clients because I have had bad experiences and I'm not willing to put myself out as a target. And it's happened a few times, rarely, but it's happened where I'm in a classroom and I'm just attacked and I'm like, no. So I ask better questions before I go into situations, and I make sure I have allies. You know, I did a talk once with hundreds of people and I knew I was going to be the only person of color, as I'm not doing this unless I have, like, you know, some allies. And they were great. They were wonderful. And the people were wonderful, but you're never totally sure because you're kind of exposing yourself sometimes. And we do want uncomfortable questions. And I always, you know, we talked about that. I always start with an icebreaker that makes us uncomfortable so people do. But on the personal side, it's not always easy, depending on how those questions are asked and if you feel it's a personal attack, et cetera. So I found for myself, that's how I navigate it. But as I get, you know, older and wiser, I've learned to be more selective about the types of mandates I take. And sometimes I say, you know what, I don't think I'm the right person. I think you need a man for this one. And it's fine. You know, we all have roles to play or different, you know, identities that we have to play in different roles. And I find that's one of the ways that I cope. But it's great to have allies and a great network. Absolutely need that network.
Thank you. So I think we'll end there. It's on the hour. I wanted to thank our panelists from all over the world for joining us. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. We'll have another webinar probably end of May that you'll hear about, which is talking about Generation Y and how boomers can learn and lead from what they learned from millennials and Gen Z. So that'll be our next topic. This was really fun. Thank you, Marcel, Jaxa, Seema, and Flavian for being here today. It was really a joy. And I wish you all a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. And I hope to see you for our next event in a month from now.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great
so much,
day,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody.